Welcome and thank you for joining us at this All That Matters Online 2020 Sports Track panel on the media rights business. My name is Kevin McCullagh, Senior Analyst for Asia Pacific at SportBusiness, the sports industry news and data publisher. The sports media rights business is at a challenging point in its history here in Asia Pacific and around the world. Even before COVID-19 struck, decades of incredible growth were grinding to a halt in markets around the world. What had been a roaring engine of sports industry revenue growth from the 1990s until very recently had started to break down. And now COVID-19 has very much thrown a spanner in the works. The consequences for the sports business are profound. By SportBusiness figures, media rights revenues were around $51 billion in 2019. There is talk of the need for new models in the sports media rights business, but as yet it's not completely clear what these might be. Now, there's no suggestion that revenues are going to disappear completely overnight, and new opportunities are constantly emerging, whether that's via new technology and new markets. But it's critical for everyone in the industry to appreciate the new landscape, and to help us find our bearings within it, I'm delighted to be joined by three deeply experienced sports media rights executives for today's discussion. From IMG Media, one of the chief protagonists in the sports media rights business's growth story over the last 20 years, we have SVP and Head of Asia Pacific, Chris Guinness. We have Aarti, Dabas, Chief Media Officer at Formula E, the electric car racing series, and one of the sports industry's most inventive and interesting new rights holders. And from China Sports Media, one of the leading agencies from one of the biggest growth markets in the media rights business, until recently at least, we have Geng, Senior Director of Strategy, Rights and Business Development. I'll speak to each one of them in turn for about 8 minutes, and then everyone will have a chance to wrap up their thoughts at the end. So let's begin. Chris, first of all, thanks very much for joining us today from Hong Kong.
Pleasure.
Chris, do you concur with my rather gloomy setup about the overall state of the business? What's the market trajectory as you have seen it, and have you ever experienced market conditions like these?
Well, I do agree with almost everything that you've said. I think it's pretty clear that even before COVID struck, the decline in paid television in a lot of places around the world, especially in Asia Pacific, was having an impact on the sports business. And the COVID impact, clearly when sport was removed from our screens for a period of time, had that immediate impact. But I think as people start to emerge and as sport starts to return to screens, which in turn has given rights holders leverage to at least collect the money they've been owed, apart from changing things like force majeure clauses in contracts, which will forevermore be included, pandemic or pandemics. I think that the question mark for broadcasters, irrespective of demanding refunds due to content not being available, is the return of sport, for the most part behind closed doors, is also challenging media entities to say they're not quite getting what they had in the past. And I think the pay television decline before COVID struck was very much sort of changing the focus to the growth of OTT and the growth of OTT platforms, particularly in entertainment, which we're all aware of. And I think that whilst OTT has a future, I think that the challenge with OTT, or the fact that OTT from a sports perspective hasn't worked as yet, is the link between pricing of that service, which is designed to capture, target the younger generation who may be more resistant to pay for content, and of course the enormous cost of acquiring content in the first place. And something has to give in that regard, and logic would dictate that that will drive down the price of sports rights. I don't think it's solely going to be on that side. I think the pricing of OTT services needs to be more carefully thought through in the context of the audience, not necessarily only being that younger audience that is traditionally averse to paying for content. I think there's an older audience that, if they can be offered a more targeted, a more sort of streamlined opportunity to watch the content that they want to watch, and they can have a destination for a sport or several sports, then I think that they will be in a position to pay for it. And I think that hasn't been fully explored. I can't hear you, Kevin. Sorry.
We're clearly in a bit of a dip when it comes to sports media rights values at the moment. How deep and prolonged do you expect this downturn to be, and can you envisage a return to growth?
Well, as I say, I think that the COVID impact is unique, and that's stating the obvious. And obviously, that will have an impact. But as long as sport returns to people's screens and gets played, then to a certain extent, the enormous impact we've seen this year will continue to ease. Having said all of that, I do think that it will be a moment, as I said a moment ago, for media entities to reflect on what is the right model going forward. And as I say, it's that link between the cost of the content and the pricing of the service that you're offering. But there is no doubt that the impact will be felt for the remainder of this year and probably into next year. But we certainly as a business are seeing a return to not quite normality by any means, but a return to revenue growth next year from a position of, quite frankly, Armageddon this year.
You touched on new models there, Chris. There is a lot of discussion of new models being required for the business. What are the credible new models that you see being tried in the market? Can you get into any detail on the sort of mechanisms and instruments that new types of deals or sales processes might contain?
Well, I mean, maybe I'm being overly simplistic, but I personally believe that in general, any advertising driven model, albeit that there may be opportunities on free to air, but digitally, I think from a sports perspective, most opportunities for growth and revenue growth in particular will be driven by subscription. So SVOD models, I believe, will continue to dominate. As I say, it's about at what level those services are priced.
Chris, agencies have been front and center of the media rights growth story. More recently, even some of the big beasts have been wrong-footed by the changes in the market. Can you tell us how IMG Media's strategy and approach is evolving, and how its role and relationships vis-a-vis rights holders and media platforms is changing?
Yes, so as most people know, we were acquired by William Morris Endeavour in 2015, and when we were acquired with the intention for William Morris Endeavour to create this global entertainment and sports platform, they made it very, very clear that they wanted to change the balance within IMG between representation and ownership from an 80-20 position in favour of representation to more of a balance between ownership and representation. So subsequently, they've made over 20 acquisitions, the biggest of which is UFC. And I think it's very important going forward that agencies such as ourselves have content that we own vitally. Having said all of that, I do believe that two new phenomena are offering opportunities for agencies. One is the fact that rights holders that have taken their rights in-house for understandable reasons, but thinking that they can do that job themselves in more sort of affluent times, are now facing the stark reality that, in markets such as these, they will need help and people on the ground to help them steer through what is obviously uniquely troubled waters. And so I do think there will be an opportunity there. And the second point, which is a really sort of significant change, is the emergence and the interest of private equity groups. And I think from that perspective, there will always be an opportunity for agencies or individuals to lend their expertise to those entities in helping them to focus in on the opportunities that they want to look at from an investment perspective.
Thanks very much, Chris, and we'll come back to you at the end to get your final thoughts. Aarti, welcome to All That Matters Online 2020, and thank you for joining us today from Abu Dhabi.
Dubai, actually, although it's United Arab Emirates, so it counts.
Okay, thank you. Aarti, from your rights holder perspective, what's your assessment of today's sports media rights market compared to previous years? And do you think rights holders are adapting and adjusting successfully to the changes that we're seeing?
I think what's important is let's talk about the media market as a whole, because I think sports is part of the industry. And if you look at the media market as a whole and the consumer, because that's really important, we all are trying to reach that fan consumer. I read a stat somewhere that 95% of the people watch media. I think that's really critical. What we are trying to say is the audience is there. The second step is, how do we actually reach that audience, and how does sport reach that audience? Because there's such a fragmentation with the number of entertainment options. The good news there is, whether it's good news, I mean, sports basically for many people, and in Asia Pacific, where we are talking about, is really an escapism, right? It's escape from reality, the real world, and actually get into submerge into this world where it's wonderful, teams are winning, there's emotion, high emotion. We saw that there was a big break from sport. What happened is people were still missing sport content. So what started happening is shoulder content started being consumed. There were high viewing numbers for documentaries on Netflix, Amazon. So the appetite for sport is still there. The appetite for proper storytelling is still there. And the narrative of live sport provides that great storytelling opportunity. So I don't think that's going anywhere. And we saw from the early numbers from Bundesliga, there were record audience numbers. So that appetite is there. The second thing is about revenues for us sports rights owners. What's going to happen? Definitely this year, and you gave a number, I think what's going to happen this year, which everybody should brace themselves for, is there's a reduction in revenue. And I was reading somewhere it's going to be 30 to 33%. But let's look at the larger picture over here. I think it's a great time for rights owners to actually realize their business models. I know we are talking about new models, about where this is headed. It's actually, in some ways, it's a great learning experience. This year has been for many of them, because it's really important as rights owners. What used to happen in the past is, you did deals, you handed over all your asset and brand and fans over to broadcasters. They did a great job at packaging the rights. They probably sometimes overpaid for the rights, because of the market conditions. But in the process, the rights owners never had a direct relationship with the fans. And I think now is a time, and some of them, and without taking examples, have benefited from these direct relationships with fans in terms of the content that they've been putting out. So I think the direct to consumer relationship is important. And over that, we build the models, whether we, take those consumers and speak to a broadcaster saying, here are the consumers, let's do something with it, or we take it to the sponsors. We can only build a B2B business if we have a D2C relationship. And I think that's really important. And rights holders, you can see, are adapting in terms of the kind of content they're creating. Then there is the overheads of costs and production. So I think, but it all stems from the fact is, can we reach out to the fans that exist there? And can we actually engage with them through our sports properties? I think that's critical, because the fans are there, they are watching. We have to tap into them and get them back on the screens.
Yes, I was going to ask you next, Aarti, about this talk about new models, and ask you to kind of get into some brass tacks, if possible, and ask you what sort of instruments and mechanisms you could see being introduced to rights deals and sales processes in the future. You talked there about gathering data from fans. Is that at the heart of it, these relationships and data on fans? What other changes do you see to your rights deals going forward?
I think generally everybody is going to look for reduced risk. I think what we are seeing with what the pandemic has done is lots of people invest a lot of money, and the days of, I think it's going to continue in certain sports that still command that, the days of huge minimum guarantees where, there's one broadcaster taking the risk and getting all these rights. And then, the rights holder sitting comfortably and saying, okay, we'll just produce a world feed and give it to you. I think those days are changing. What needs to happen is two things, I think. One is the revenue share model has to slightly change. And I was reading about something that happened in Japan actually with DAZN, you know, what they've done with the J League, in the sense there is a reduced risk for the investor, and there's an increased risk for the rights holder. So I think somewhere you have to start believing in the product you're handing out, right? You need to say that, okay, this is the advertising revenue, or there's a shared revenue model. So I think minimum guarantees, and I think I'm going to caveat this by saying the big sports properties will probably live this out longer, but eventually it's going to be a shared revenue model at some point. You know, you can't expect in today's day and age for somebody else to put the risk, and maybe the people do it, you know, because of market competition. The second thing is there has to be more investment in the product. Rights owners cannot just sit back and say it's the broadcaster's job to build the brand. I think it's a collective job to build the brand. So these two things are really important. It's about shared risk and more investment in the product so that you own the product, which will help you in the future to build that direct relationship with fans as well, you know. So data is important, but if you look at the immediate need of new models, it's about, yes, do you know your fans better? Can you know your fans better in a shared relationship? But it's reduced risk for investors, and it's more investment in the product by the rights owners as well.
Aarti, it's always struck me that talk about new models always seems to imply a greater commitment of resources than from rights holders than they were required to do in the past, I think. Are rights holders experiencing an ever-increasing demand for investment in their operations, in their data, and their production? And if so, is it sustainable?
A good question. I think if you look at it, it's actually a choice of rights owners, right? You can actually stick with the old models where you just provide a live product and you expect the broadcasters or investors or rights holders to do the rest. I think what really needs to happen is, one is we spoke about the direct relationship with fans, you know, which we need to develop. And I think that relationship doesn't come through just building a live product. I think there are a lot of ancillary products you have to make and content series you have to make. The second thing is, as we've seen during the pandemic, the demand is not only there for the live. Yes, live is the core, but you have to build shoulder content around it. You know, it's about actually having that narrative right through, whether it's the sport is live or not. How do you engage with the fans? So yes, there is an onus on rights owners to invest more, to create those opportunities to engage with fans and storytelling, and to actually understand the fans better. I think the one thing that I probably didn't speak about was, you know, the future media rights models and you know, this big reliance on pay TV networks coming in. And I think Chris alluded to it at the start, you know, the OTT side. And we are seeing this big shift in Asia. You see what Disney Plus Hotstar has just done. You know, they've gone in Indonesia, they've launched something. I think the model is shifting, and it will shift. And with my background in cricket, I see what Hotstar did in India, right? Like the shift, and they made that huge investment into this. What needs to happen is, from a rights holder's perspective, is need to diversify the portfolio to reduce the risk as well. You know, it can't be that everything sits on one portfolio. It's about actually seeing what the right fit is and experimenting a bit as well. So I think that's really important from a rights owner's perspective, that to look at, do we just go with one pay TV operator and sit back and see what happens? Because those days are gone. I think you just have to keep experimenting and evolving and working with the different rights holders in the market. And, you know, in some cases, as Chris said, agencies play a great role, you know, so I don't think you can just say that this is the one model that fits, especially for international properties like us. We are not experts in all the markets. I think we know our key markets, we'll probably talk directly, but there are so many other international markets that we can build. And it's about actually seeing where the fans are, what the consumer is doing, where the businesses are investing, where the advertising money is going, and then deciding how you want to place your product and what you want to produce for that market.
Okay, and Aarti, do you, obviously, as we said, we're in something of a trough or a downslope in terms of media rights revenues at the moment. Do you envisage a return to media rights revenue growth, or how long a period of stagnation or decline are you expecting?
I mean, I was joking, I think, before we were offline saying, we are all in the media rights industry, so we better be positive about it and we believe in it. But, I think the way I'd like to answer this, Kevin, is we shouldn't just say media rights revenues. I think it's about overall revenues because the lines are blurring. In the previous job that I was, in the last 3 years, we had a great push to deliver more advertising revenues, and it was our own push through digital for sponsors. I think what is going to happen is, yes, there is going to be a dip because as the market, there's a downturn in almost every industry except probably the digital space and people who know data, which is, again, I come back to the point, people who know their fans, people who have that direct relationship or understand that fans are going to fare well in the longer term. So I think that in the longer term, sports is not going anywhere. It's here to stay. It's always one of the top forms of entertainment, escaping reality. It's about how do you slice and dice your product? Where does sponsorship come in? Where does media rights come in? Digital interplay, knowing your fans. I think at the end of the day, you have to make yourself you have to take some risks in the short term to protect the long-term future of sport and your rights.
Great stuff, Aarti. Thank you very much. And I'll come back to you for your final thoughts. Now I would like to turn to Eric. Eric, thank you very much for joining us today from China.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you.
Eric, the Chinese market is at a particularly interesting moment. As we speak, many major media rights deals are being renegotiated, prompted by COVID-19, but really the issues predated that. Can you summarize for us what's happening in the Chinese market right now and why it's happening?
Okay. Well, I heard most of the major deals are being negotiated, including the European football, the NBA, the UFC, the WWE. And I think the broadcasters are targeting a significant reduction rather than a marginal deduction. So that's what I have heard. I think the COVID-19 is just a trigger or just prompt this situation. The main reason is that most of the broadcasters are suffering a big loss on the properties they invested. I assume that most of them can hardly generate 50% of the media rights value they invested in. So they have suffering such kind of losses for the past 3 to 5 years. Now the COVID-19 gave them a good excuse to renegotiate deals, but also it's a hard time for the market. When the rights holders come to the market and find alternatives, they find that there are very few alternatives for them. So that's the situation now. As said, the main reason is the overspending in the last 3 to 5 years. I think now for the rights holders and for broadcasters, there is hard times for them to negotiate now.
What do you foresee being the kind of outcome of this period, Eric? How do you foresee the Chinese market changing? Whenever Le Sports collapsed some years ago, it seems that the big spending just started up again. Is this time different? And if so, why?
I think this time would be quite different. At that time, it's just the problem of the sports itself. Many other companies thought they have opportunities, they have the room to grow, especially that 3 to 5 years ago, the growth of Chinese economy is still rapid. But in the last 2 years is slower. And after the COVID-19, the economy will be affected. Even though we think the impact will be not that huge, but still there will be some big influence. And secondly, I think if we, for the foreign properties, we all feel that the political tension would play a role in this. Look at what happened with NBA and CCTV. And also, we all heard a story that CCTV also downgraded the ranking of Premier League due to the China-UK tension back in 2 months ago. So it's hard times for the broadcasters to come back as ambitious and as aggressive as 3 years ago.
Yes, I was going to ask you, Eric, about this political element is clearly affecting more and more deals. What do you think international properties that are selling into China must understand about this and be aware of?
Well, I think if you deal with the Chinese company, if you deal with Chinese people, political is a topic that you can't avoid. And in recent years, and especially in this year, is more and more evident that this is a key sector that we need to take into consideration. Just for example, the Premier League rights deal. After they terminate with PP Sports, we talked with several broadcasters and asked them if they have interest to take over the Premier League. And some of the broadcasters, their reply is very simple. It's just that politically probably it's not right time to take over this deal, considering the China-UK relationship now. So this scared away some of the spenders who have a deep pocket. That's what I can see. And also for the NBA deal, is the most important deal for Tencent. Is kind of a strategic deal, not only a sports deal, but for the Tencent ecosystem is a very important deal. But now, given what happened last year and this year, they renegotiate the deal, they renegotiate the price, and also they just proposed a new model for the rights in China for the future.
Eric, addressing this idea of new models, you've heard Chris and Aarti talking about them. Maybe rights holders sharing more of the risk in rights deals. Do you see any new methods or approaches like this emerging in China?
Yeah, I think that's also the case in China. In the past, it's a simply buyout, and the platforms will do whatever they do to monetize and commercial their content. But now, given the reasons just discussed previously, I think the platforms will prefer to negotiate a minimum guarantee plus revenue sharing model with the rights holders. And also for the rights holders, it makes sense that if you want to get benefit from this market, you need to invest it in your own resources and bear your risk. It's not like just I sold you the rights, I come the market probably once per year or 3 times per year during the cycle, and then I walked away. It's not that kind of market. And then I would say this morning I read this interview by Richard Masters on the UK media. He said that we will choose the let me see. He said that we will choose the right path forward in a very big, crucial market rather than the quickest. I think that's the smart attitude. Rather than thinking just short term and just focusing on the highest value. It's just you need to have a long run thinking in the most important overseas market.
Eric, there was plenty of irrational spending in the Chinese market in the last 5 years, but one of the most central rational explanations for the growth was the growth of the subscription OTT video sector. What's your outlook for that business model in China? Is there still headroom from growth there, and can sports profit from that?
Well, I think that's still the most important model in the Chinese market. The sports industry is not reaching their let's say the ceiling of the OTT subscription. But let's see what happened with the entertainment business. From I think 5 years, 10 years ago, people do not believe the entertainment subscription. People say, well, we have been used to every content free in the Chinese market. But from that time, including Tencent, iQIYI, and the Youku, they all invested in the premium content and charge the subscribers some fee for accessing to the content. But now the latest figure we saw from last year is that I think the user base of the subscription user for iQIYI's entertainment content surpassed 100 million mark. So that's a quite big number. And also Tencent's number and the Youku's number is not far from that. Is also both of them are close to 90 million users. So that's quite significant. If we consider that the sports industry is not as popular as entertainment in China, but if only we can reach 10% of that figure is 10 million. 10 million subscribers for a higher subscription fee would mean a good industry for us in the sport business. But I would say that won't happen in 2 years, 3 years. Probably we need another 5 to 10 years.
Thank you, Eric. Guys, I'd like to go back to everyone again to get your final reflections and perhaps finish on an upbeat note, if possible, and indulge in a little thought experiment. Chris and Aarti, I know you said you're able to answer this. I want you to imagine that you're one of these private equity investors that's sitting on the sidelines of the sport business right now, with flush with cash and ready to invest, excluding your own organization. Where do you think you would invest that cash? And indeed, I'll allow you 2 investments if you would like. One with your heart, that is maybe more of a passion of yours, and one with your head that you think will certainly turn a profit in the coming years. Chris, can I turn to you first? Get some final thoughts on what you've heard so far, and find out where you would invest your private equity millions.
Well, I think what Eric and Aarti have said, but I agree with everything that they've said. And I think Aarti's point about the balance shifting between agencies, broadcasters, and rights holders in regard to rights holders needing to work harder to have direct relationships with their fans is absolutely crucial. Having said that, I think my broad optimism, and the answer to your question is, when you look at the fact that private equity is looking at sport, they're looking at sport for 3 reasons. Sport is still a hugely attractive investment. Obviously, valuations at the moment because of COVID are way down, and a lot of rights holders are needing external investment for the first time, given the critical situation that they face themselves in. But specifically to answer your question, I think there are huge opportunities in investing in specific sports that perhaps regard themselves as being global, but are struggling in different parts of the world. I mean, rugby is a sport that comes to mind, which is attracting a huge amount of attention. I see that being of interest. Football, obviously, will always attract interest. There's rumors about various private equity companies circling around Syria, etc. So I think broadly, I think the interest from private equity endorses why sport is attractive. I think having said that, and not wanting to sort of finish on a note of caution, while I'm optimistic, those private equity investors still need a return on that investment. So whilst valuations are low, it's a question of how they realize that return. So it's a very interesting sort of environment. And the final thing I would say is that don't forget that whilst we all talk about the younger generation having a shrinking attention span, and therefore perhaps live sport doesn't have the same value that it used to, I fundamentally disagree. I think that's one of the cachets of sport. Watching sport live remains a hugely interesting proposition, particularly in regard, and yes, it's less relevant in Asia at the moment because of regulation, particularly in regard to the growth of sports betting. And I don't think anyone should underestimate how big and how rapidly growing that phenomenon is. So yeah, if I was private equity, I'd definitely look at certain sports to invest in. And the whole phenomenon of sports betting is something that is intriguing and will continue to fuel growth all over the world.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. Aarti, same to you. Final thoughts, and where would you invest in sport?
Yeah, I think I'll probably put my heart and head together, because you said, two options. And completely, there's valuations, there's etc. There's different things to be done. But I think if you look at how the world has changed, and obviously I can't invest in Formula E, otherwise that's where I would have gone, and I'll tell you why. I think the reasons will be similar. I think what you've seen with this pandemic is that there are a lot of things that have happened around the world. There have been different movements. People have come out on the streets, even in the midst of a pandemic, for different reasons. But I think what people want right now is to align with a purpose and some meaning. And I know this sounds like it's coming from the heart, but let me tell you, I think businesses that have diversity, that focus on inclusion, that are purpose-driven businesses genuinely are aligned with all these factors are good for the future, for the business. So for me, I would invest in women's sport, and that's really close to my heart, but also thinking through the head because it's low valuation. It's almost like the prices are down in Dubai. You'd rather buy a house and rent a house, renovate the house, build a brand new product and go out and sell it. And I really think, having worked in women's cricket and seeing the huge opportunity of growth and what we achieved in whatever the years that we were, I think this is the low-hanging fruit and often underestimated by lots of businesses. So I think if somebody really looks into this deeply with numbers, there's a huge opportunity, and it may be starting with certain territories, even if you don't have to start global. There's a huge opportunity, and I think it's probably people are realizing it, but that's where I would invest my money, women's sport.
Thank you, Aarti. And Eric, I know it might be tricky for you to pick out an investment, but I can ask you for your final thoughts and maybe something that makes you optimistic and hopeful for the future of the sports media rights business.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, I think, from the Chinese market perspective, I'm still optimistic about the media rights business, given the following 4 reasons. First, I think the sports culture is more mature in China than before, because in the past, sports is is quite luxury product for us. But in the last 20 years, especially last 10 years, youngsters are getting access to more and more sport playing a more important role than before in our country. So when they grow up, they will love sports, they will participate in sports, and they will consume sports. So that's the first point. And the second point, I think, is about the consuming habit. Let's say, just as previously explained, the entertainment subscribers is surpassing the 100 million mark. I think sport can reach 10 million mark is a very healthy industry for us in the coming years. And the third part is we are still confident in the growth of the economy in China, even though the COVID-19, etc. I think domestically we can supply everything to ourselves, and we can still collaborate with foreign countries. So we are quite confident about the economy, and that as a cornerstone, we have confidence in the sports industry. And the fourth point is, I think the development of technology play a key role. If we see what Amazon did in many markets, and our equivalent of Amazon, Jingdong, what have they done? What's in their strategy? And if we can see many of the leading technology companies are coming to the sports industry. And I think except US, China play a key role in those technology companies. So when they invest in more and more in the sports industry, we have a big potential to grow in the future.
Wonderful stuff. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Chris and Aarti as well, for joining us and All That Matters audience today. We covered a lot of ground there. I think we touched on a lot of the threads that are important to the sports industry, not just the sports media business. And I think we even found some positive, or at least some things we can build on, or we should be building on. Viewers, I hope you found that as thought-provoking and valuable as I did. And thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and goodbye for now.